Story number 1.
The Forgotten Tunnel. In the sleepy town of Greystone, there was a legend about an old railway tunnel hidden deep in the woods. The tunnel, abandoned for decades, had once been part of a train line that mysteriously shut down after a terrible accident. Stories swirled about ghostly figures and strange sounds echoing from within, but no one dared to venture close. Except for Liam, a thrill-seeker with a penchant for the paranormal. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and an iron resolve, he decided to explore the infamous tunnel. It took Liam hours to locate the entrance, overgrown with ivy and nearly hidden by the dense forest. The stone archway was cracked and rusted tracks led into the pitch-black maw. Above the entrance, faded letters spelled out a warning: "Do not enter." He hesitated for a moment, then turned on his flashlight and stepped inside. The air grew colder immediately, carrying a damp, earthy smell. Water dripped from the ceiling and his footsteps echoed in the silence. The tunnel walls were lined with graffiti. But as he ventured deeper, the markings became strange. Symbols he didn't recognize. Spiraling patterns that seemed to shift when he looked away. Half an hour in, Liam realized the tracks were gone. They'd been replaced by dirt, as if the ground had swallowed them whole. His flashlight flickered. Cursing under his breath, he smacked it until the light steadied. That's when he heard it. A faint sound like a train whistle far in the distance. It didn't make sense. No trains had run here in decades. But the sound grew louder, accompanied by a low rumble beneath his feet. "Hello?" Liam called, his voice trembling. The whistle shrieked again, closer this time, and his flashlight dimmed. Panic set in as the rumble turned into the distinct clatter of train wheels on tracks. He pressed himself against the wall, his flashlight now barely aglow. Suddenly, a beam of light appeared in the distance, barreling toward him. It was a train, but not just any train. It was blackened and warped, its windows shattered and its headlights burned an unnatural red. Sparks flew from its wheels as it roared through the tunnel. But the most horrifying part was the passengers. Pale faces stared out from the broken windows. Their hollow eyes locked on Liam. Their mouths moved silently as if screaming without sound. The train passed inches from him, the wind nearly knocking him over. And then, just as quickly as it had come, it vanished, leaving the tunnel silent once more. Liam's legs trembled as he tried to make sense of what he'd seen. Turning to leave, he froze. The graffiti on the walls had changed. Instead of symbols and spirals, there were now crude drawings of trains, their windows filled with the same pale faces he had just seen. Below them were words scratched into the stone. "Join us." The flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Plunged into darkness, Liam fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to guide his steps. But no matter how far he walked, the entrance to the tunnel didn't appear. The air grew heavier, and the faint sound of whispers began to echo around him. At first, he couldn't make out the words, but as they grew louder, they became clear. "Stay with us. You're one of us now. Don't leave." Desperate, Liam started running, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tripped on something, a rusted railway tie, and fell hard. As he scrambled to his feet, his phone slipped from his hand and skittered away. In its faint light, he saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their forms translucent and shimmering. They wore old-fashioned clothes, their faces eerily calm, but their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. One of them reached out, its hand inches from Liam's face. "Come with us," it whispered. With a scream, Liam grabbed his phone and sprinted in the opposite direction. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices pleading, demanding, calling his name. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the faint outline of the tunnel's entrance. He burst out into the forest, collapsing onto the ground. Behind him, the tunnel seemed to hum, a low vibration that made the ground tremble. And then, silence. Liam made it back to town, shaken but alive. He tried to tell his friends what had happened, but no one believed him. When he returned to the woods a week later to prove his story, the tunnel was gone. In its place was an overgrown hill with no sign that the railway had ever existed. But sometimes, late at night, Liam could still hear the distant whistle of a train. And in his dreams, the pale faces stared back at him, waiting for the day he would return.
Story number 2.
The Shadow Room. In the heart of a bustling city stood the old Harlow building, a relic from the 1920s with its Art Deco design and towering facade. While most of the floors had been converted into modern apartments and offices, the top floor was sealed off. Rumor had it that something terrible had happened there in the 1940s. A group of people disappeared during a séance, leaving the room untouched ever since. When Laura, an amateur paranormal investigator, heard about it, she couldn't resist. She arranged to sneak in with her camera, convinced the story was just urban legend. The elevator didn't go to the top floor, so Laura climbed the narrow staircase, her flashlight casting long, shifting shadows on the cracked walls. The air grew colder the higher she climbed. When she reached the top, the door to the sealed floor stood slightly ajar, the lock broken. Pushing it open, she stepped into a long hallway lined with faded wallpaper. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled of decay and old wood. At the end of the hall was the room. Its door was painted black, the only one in the building. Scratched into its surface were strange symbols, spirals, and what looked like stick figures. Laura hesitated, a chill running down her spine. But her curiosity won out. She pushed the door open. The room was surprisingly empty, save for an old round table in the center, surrounded by chairs. On the table was a single candle, unlit, and a dusty Ouija board. Laura's camera whirred to life as she began recording. "This is Laura Mayfield, inside the infamous Harlow Building Shadow Room," she said, her voice shaky. "Let's see what's really going on here." As she walked around the room, she noticed something strange. No matter where she stood, her shadow didn't appear on the walls. She waved her flashlight around, but the walls remained blank. A sense of unease crept in. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the empty room. Laura ran to the door and yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Okay, very funny," she said aloud, hoping someone was playing a prank. Then she heard it. A soft whisper. It came from the corner of the room. Turning slowly, Laura shined her flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on a dark figure standing in the corner, its outline faint and wavering. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but its shadow stretched across the floor, slithering toward her like spilled ink. Laura backed away, her breath quickening. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to speak directly into her mind. "Stay with us. You open the door. We need you." The room grew colder, her breath visible in the air. Laura's flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging her into darkness. She fumbled for her phone, using its light to scan the room. The shadow figure was gone. But something else had changed. The walls were no longer blank. They were covered in shadows, figures twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. Laura spun around, trying to make sense of it, but the shadows began to move, peeling themselves off the walls. The figures surrounded her, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. They didn't touch her, but their presence was suffocating. One leaned close, its hollow face inches from hers. "You're part of us now," it whispered. Laura screamed, dropping her phone. The light from the screen illuminated the table, where the Ouija board now glowed faintly. The planchette moved on its own, spelling out 2 words. No escape. Desperate, Laura grabbed her phone and ran for the door. This time it opened and she bolted down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the empty building. She didn't stop until she reached the street, the cold night air hitting her like a slap. But when she turned to look back at the building, she froze. In the window of the top floor, shadows moved, figures watching her, their forms pressed against the glass. Laura never spoke about what happened that night, but those who knew her noticed she was different afterward, quieter, always avoiding dark spaces. And sometimes, in the right light, her shadow seemed to stretch in impossible ways, as if it wasn't entirely her own. The Harlow building's top floor remains sealed to this day, but if you stand outside at night you might see them, shadows in the window, waiting for someone to open the door again.
Story number 3.
The Doll in the Attic. When Emma inherited her grandmother's old Victorian house, she saw it as a chance to start over. The creaky wooden floors and stained wallpaper didn't bother her. The house had character, and she loved it. But the attic was different. From the moment she first entered the house, the attic door at the end of the upstairs hallway seemed to hum with an unspoken presence. It was always cold near the door, even when the rest of the house was warm. One stormy evening, curiosity got the better of her. Armed with a flashlight, Emma decided to explore the attic. The door groaned as she pushed it open, revealing a steep set of stairs leading up into darkness. The air smelled musty, with a faint undertone of something sour. When she reached the top, her flashlight beam swept across the room. Dust motes floated in the stale air, and old trunks, boxes, and furniture cluttered the space. But in the center of the room, sitting on a small rocking chair, was a doll. It was unlike any doll Emma had ever seen. Its porcelain face was cracked, and its glass eyes seemed too lifelike, as though they were watching her every move. Its lips were painted a faded red, and its black curls were matted and uneven. A frayed dress hung off its tiny frame, and one hand was missing, leaving a jagged stump. A chill ran down Emma's spine, but she dismissed it as her imagination. It was just a doll, after all. She picked it up, intending to throw it away, but as her fingers brushed its cracked skin, a faint giggle echoed in the attic. Emma froze. The sound was unmistakable, childlike and high-pitched. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the corners of the attic, but there was nothing there. Shaking her head, she carried the doll downstairs and left it on the kitchen counter. That night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she lay in bed, she heard faint creaking, as if someone were walking down the hall. When she got up to check, the house was empty. But the attic door was ajar. The next morning, the doll was gone. Emma searched the kitchen, thinking she might have misplaced it, but it wasn't there. When she went back to the attic, the rocking chair was empty. She tried to convince herself it was a trick of her memory, but the unease lingered. Over the following days, strange things began happening. Doors would slam on their own, lights flickered, and Emma often heard faint giggling or whispers when she was alone. One evening, as she was cleaning the living room, the doll reappeared. It was sitting on the coffee table, its head tilted as though it were looking right at her. Emma's heart raced. She hadn't put it there. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at it to see a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Why did you leave me?" She dropped the phone, her hands trembling. When she looked back at the doll, its head had turned to face her fully, though she hadn't touched it. Desperate to rid herself of the thing, Emma drove to the edge of town and tossed the doll into a dumpster. That night she slept better, convinced it was over. But when she woke the next morning, the doll was sitting on her bedside table, its cracked face inches from hers. Scratched into the wood beneath it were the words, "Don't leave me again." Emma's unease turned to terror. She tried burning the doll, but it wouldn't catch fire. She tried smashing it, but the pieces reassembled themselves by morning. The doll seemed to grow more lifelike with each passing day. Its eyes followed her, and sometimes she swore she saw its lips move. The giggling grew louder, and shadows danced in the corners of the house. One night Emma woke to find the doll standing on her chest. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its cracked lips parted to speak. "Stay with me," it whispered, its voice layered with the cries of countless others. Emma screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the cold air around her. The doll leaned closer, its glass eyes reflecting her terrified face. "You're mine now," it hissed. The next morning, Emma's neighbors noticed she hadn't come outside to tend her garden. When they checked the house, they found it empty. But in the attic, the rocking chair wasn't empty anymore. A new doll sat there, its porcelain face eerily resembling Emma's. And if you listened closely, you could hear faint giggles echoing from the shadows.